Hi, my name is Alan Seekman. I work with Beneficial Designs, and we developed the hip grip. The hip grip is a dynamic pelvic stabilization device that provides both lateral and anterior-posterior stability for the pelvis. It also allows the pelvis to roll through its normal anterior-posterior range of motion for tilt. The normal technique that we use when we're tasked to keep somebody's pelvis in position in the wheelchair is to run a hip belt across the front of the pelvis, often across the ASIS, or possibly a more rigid restraint such as a subasis bar, a rigid bar across the front of the pelvis. These techniques and others will serve very well to hold the pelvis back in position in the wheelchair, but they do limit the ability of the pelvis to go through its normal range of motion when what you're trying to do is increase function in the wheelchair. So we're always faced with this dilemma. The dilemma is I want to keep the pelvis in position in the wheelchair, and yet I want to allow the normal range of motion and the normal reaching, which requires the pelvis to go through its normal range of motion as well. So the hip grip was designed with that in mind. We were trying to figure out a way to keep the pelvis stable, to keep it secure and oriented properly in the wheelchair, and yet not take away the ability of the pelvis to move. So with the hip grip, we use the lateral and posterior pads of the hip grip assembly to control the lateral and posterior movement of the pelvis, and then a hip belt across the ASIS portions of the pelvis will lock the pelvis in and really grip the pelvis in position in the wheelchair frame. That gives us the stability that we're looking for, both laterally and front to rear. But the real difference here, and what's really different about how this device works, is that there is a pivot point on the side bracket right down at the level of the seat surface that allows the pelvis to run through its normal anterior-posterior range of motion, thereby restoring all the forward reach that we've lost by using other techniques to hold the pelvis in position. And it can be adjusted to provide accommodations for pelvic obliquity, pelvis rotation front to rear, and anterior-posterior tilt positions. With the client in the hip grip, you can see the orientation of the hip belt. The belt is attached low and snugly across the ASIS. You see the belt coming in across the front of the pad assembly. This belt needs to be quite snug to really grip the pelvis into the hip grip assembly and allow the pelvis to not move around within the hip grip before the hip grip starts to move. You'll see when the client leans forward, you'll see how much reach they can achieve with a forward lean. There are tension springs along the back side of the hip grip pivot assembly in light, medium, and strong strengths that will allow you to vary the amount of resistance to forward lean or the amount of strength in helping the person and the pelvis return back to neutral pelvis posture. That concludes the basic installation instructions for the hip grip. If you have questions that haven't been answered, please contact Bodypoint Customer Service.